So hear me out. It doesn't actually make mathematical sense to ever be margin called. So everyone from this guy Jack to the famous Bill Huang, um, I think lacks some understanding here, and I'll do my best to explain it with. You just need to understand two things. Well, one thing is just the little formula called the Kelly criterion, which I've talked about before. So let's just, well, I'll save you watching this, but basically, this guy got up to like, he started with 20K, got it up to 75 grand, used some margin, and then eventually got margin called. So when a broker lends you money, the reason why the rate is so low, and I think he was using Robinhood, which first off, that's the first problem is you shouldn't be using Robinhood for margin. You should be using Interactive Brokers. You want to use a brokerage that um, can actually liquidate your assets, and that's because they know they'll always get their money back, and that's why they can give you margin loans for super cheap. So that's why Interactive Brokers is super low. Um, Other brokerages, I'm not too sure. Let me look it up real quick. Robinhood margin rates. See if you get the ad. So this is like Interactive Brokers' main thing here is that. So 3.5%, that's like double what Interactive Brokers is. So first off, that's the first issue is you're using Robinhood for margin, which is not good. The second thing is that margin essentially creates a fraction or a ratio that is dynamic. So you'll have, it's the ratio between the market value of what you have divided by the margin that you owe. So one of those numbers changes because the market value changes daily, but one of those stays the same unless you sell or buy more stocks, which is that amount that you owe back to the broker. So because of this ratio is dynamic and it's always changing. So it gets to a point, and this is why margin calls should never happen, is because it gets to a point where you are what's considered overbetting, and oh, that's the wrong. Oh no, that's the right one. Where you're overbetting, and that just at that point it doesn't make any mathematical sense to hold a position with that much leverage. So what happens is he started with 75,000 and maybe he borrowed 20,000. So that is a position that is let's pull it up here. So actually it'd be 20,000 divided by 70. Let's say his portfolio is 75,000 and he borrowed 20,000. So right now he's at 1.26 leverage, which is reasonable, right? But it depends on your assumptions. So just like when we analyze a stock, we have to make assumptions about what its discount rate or its expected return might be. When you look at position sizing, the way to do it optimally is you want to look at also what its implied volatility will be or its standard deviation, right? So how like it doesn't matter if a something gives you a crazy return or low return, it also matters how volatile it is because if it gives you a 2% return but it's not volatile at all, then you could just use leverage or maybe a 5% return and then you could borrow at the risk-free rate and you could use leverage. So it also matters not just the return of an asset, but the standard deviation or the volatility of that asset. So now there's another thing that we kind of have to assume, which makes it very difficult. But it gets to a point where the assumptions that you'd have to make to justify this ratio of market value to margin owed just breaks down completely and doesn't make sense. Now, what ends up happening is as the market falls, your ratio gets higher and higher. So you'd have to make more brash assumptions about your return, which could actually be true because we know that empirically most of the time when assets fall, it's a change in the discount rate. So you could just be saying like, okay, well, if Robinhood drops 50% in value, then I expect a greater return. But the volatility might remain the same. So let's say he started out with 75,000 and he borrowed 20,000. He's at 1.2x leverage, 1.26. So you can make assumptions to justify a 1.2x leverage position. Let's say it was probably 0.08, and maybe you assumed like 10% vol. Or sorry, 0.08, 10% vol. Why is that weird? 0.15. 1.8, 0.2, 0.22, 0.24. Oops. Bear with me here. So maybe you assumed Robinhood would be an 8% return and 25% standard deviation or volatility, and that would justify this position. But let's say that Robinhood drops 50%. So now instead of 75,000, you only have sorry, I'm fucking drunk as fuck. 37.5. So now, but we still owe the same amount of money. So 20,000 divided by 37.5. Now the ratio has changed. So now you're 1.53x leveraged. So what happens is now we have to change our assumptions to justify this position. Maybe now we think, okay, it's dropped 50%, maybe the return's going to go up, but is it really a point one would work. So now we have to give it a greater return. Does that make sense? Maybe because it fell in value, but let's say it drops another 50%, right? 37.5, 5 by 2. What's that? 18.75. So 20,000 divided by 18.75. And now you're at 2x leverage. So as the price falls, you have to justify the return being greater, which you kind of can, but it gets to a point where it's just silly and you have to make these like really bold assumptions about the company to justify a leveraged position. And if you don't know anything about the Kelly criterion, when you overbet whatever the number turns out to be, so you can make assumptions. You could be like, I think it's going to be 10% return, 25% vol, and it turns out to be that way. But let's say you use 2x leverage at this point. Well, you've overbet what it turned out to be, and you'll actually lose money by overbetting here instead of using the 1.6, which is the optimal size. So one thing I've noticed in just YouTube in general is like we focus a lot on the stocks, right, and what asset to own, but not at the correct sizing of that asset based on assumptions. So someone like Strongman Personal Finance who would advocate for holding VT in a tax-advantaged account, I personally don't use tax-advantaged accounts because I believe that there's a certain return and volatility with the discount rate that you get for holding a global index fund, and that's actually greater than 1, and you should actually use a little bit of leverage. But what people don't understand is that leverage assumes rebalancing. Unless you want to do some like wacky thing where you think like, oh, the asset's gone down, therefore it has a higher return, maybe, but you don't really know that, so it's probably best to just go off the averages. But as market, it's counterintuitive because when you do it correctly, like the math correctly, when markets go up, you're supposed to buy more to maintain that ratio, and when markets go down, you're supposed to sell. So at some point, the reason why you'll never get margin called is because the ratio that brokerages start to liquidate you and start to ask for their margin back is like a crazy ratio that no stock's gonna have. You'd have to assume like 20% return, like 20% vol. It's like not, you're not gonna get that in a market with interest rates as low as they are, right? So it just doesn't, it just starts to break down. So what happened to him, and a lot of people, this is why like out of the money options don't work as well, or they work very rarely, is because it's basically just an extremely leveraged position. So you see like the YOLOs on like Wall Street bets. Some of them are really, really good, but the vast majority, the ones you don't see, is like survivorship bias, is very, very bad, right? And that's because they're over betting the Kelly of what they're doing. They're just over leveraging, and at that point, the math just breaks down. You're basically guaranteed to lose at that point. So it's something similar is going on here, where as prices fall, so it drops 10%. Well, the next 10% is a greater percentage loss, and the next 10% after that is a greater percentage loss, unless you trim the position and keep that ratio in check based off your assumptions. Now, it's not really easy to make assumptions on an individual stock. What's its return and standard deviation going to be? Well, obviously, if I fucking knew that, then I could make a fuck ton of money, right? But it gets to a point where it becomes silly, where you have to assume like 20% return and 20%, like that's not going to happen, right? So if you're going to use margin and you want to use it responsibly, you have to rebalance. But again, it's counterintuitive to where if the market goes down, you have to sell to maintain that ratio, and if it goes up, you have to buy. Then you're like, well, I'm buying high and selling low, but that's just not how the math works out. It's just how you keep that ratio in check, or else it's going to just keep going down, and the percentage of your account that you're losing becomes exponentially greater and greater each fall, so you get margin called. And then you realize before you got margin called, you were holding like a 2x leverage position, when originally you had a 1.2x leverage position. It's a completely different portfolio, and all that's changed is the market value. So that's just something to be aware of. In general, you just should never get margin called, right? Um, with individual stocks, it's a little weird, but yeah, this is this is Monish per buy. Anyway, that's all I got. If you have any questions, this is a big there's a big disconnect that I don't see on YouTube Finance, is like position sizing and how important that is. It's extremely important. Leverage. And it's so cool because I use leverage. I use margin in my portfolio with the index funds, and it's a really cool system I got going on. So, if you have any questions, let me know. Peace.